You were told, my name is Eugene LaVergne. I'm here tonight to explain to you and to inform you about something that every American should know. Now, because you're involved in the Tea Party, and because you've cared enough to come out on a Friday night, I take the presumption of putting you in a class of people that is more informed than the average Joe, so to speak. So coming out of the gate, I expect you people know a little bit more about government, the rights that we're supposed to be afforded and protected, and those that are not. And I'm here to tell you that you don't have to be unhappy with the direction that our country is going, because I know you've heard it before from politicians. I'm not talking to you as a politician. I'm talking to you as a scholar. And I'll give you my curriculum vitae later. But I'm telling you, there is an answer, and it already exists, and it's so simple that in the next 45 minutes, when you hear what I have to say, it's going to be like, how come no one else ever thought of this? And of course, that's the same response I get from people, including some of the greatest scholars in the country, when I discuss this with them, and they're like, you got to get your book out. You got to get your book out, because people don't believe this. So I've come tonight not to lecture you with some cerebral, boring, diatribe about the history of the Constitution and Article the First. I'm going to make it interesting and fun, because I'm going to show you in real time the books through history that have made mistakes, that have edited the rights that you were guaranteed by the result of a revolution, by the result of people meeting at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, restructuring the government, and what we have today, to paraphrase. So it's amazing that Americans take for granted that the government we have today is in fact the government that the forefathers intended, and it's not. And I'm not just talking about the gridlock in Washington and the fact that it's a yes, no. It's become like a playground. But if I were to ask you how many members there are in the United States Senate, because you're supporting Steve Lonigan, you would obviously tell me, well, there's 50 states. The Constitution says no matter what your population is, each state gets 2. 50 times 2 is 100. That is not that complicated a concept to grasp. If I were to ask you how many voting members there are in the United States House of Representatives, it's not a test, but if you knew, the answer is 435. Then the next question becomes, and why is that? And the response from 99% of the people is, because it is. That's how it is. Now, let me tell you a story before I get into the details. A young girl gets married. She wants to cook for her husband. Something maybe old-fashioned today, but so she wants to cook a roast. So she doesn't know how to cook. So she calls her mother, and she says, Mom, how do I cook a roast? So she goes, all right, first thing you do is you cut the end off, and then you put it in the pot. She goes, okay, but wait a second. What do you mean you cut the end off? You cut the end off and you cook it for the dog. Why? So, I don't know. That's how my mother always cooked, and so, that's how I cook a roast. She goes, well, did you ever ask Grandma why she does that? She says, no. So she calls up her grandmother. And she goes, Grandma, when you cook a roast, you always cut the end off and cook it for the dog, right? She says, yeah. Why do you do that? Is it like spoiled? Is it bad? People can't eat it? What is it? She says, no, I never had a big enough pot. Well, I say this tongue in cheek. The reason why we have 435 representatives instead of something a lot different is because people were not paying attention. And it is a variation on the I never had a big enough pot story. What people don't realize is the biggest dispute and the biggest, most contentious debates and fights at the Philadelphia Convention right across the river back in 1787 in that hot summer when they were fighting over this new form of central government wasn't about what we call the First Amendment, today, speech and religion. It was not about that. It was about representation in the House of Representatives specifically. The People's House. Because again, we forget your history. Everyone realizes that when we elect a president, you people know more than the other, you don't really directly vote for a president. You vote for electors that vote for the president in the process that's come to be known essentially as the Electoral College. So the chief executive under the original Constitution, as originally configured, was not chosen directly by the people. In the Constitution as originally configured, yes, each state got 2 members in the U.S. Senate, but the senators were not chosen by the people. That didn't occur until 1913 with the passage of the 17th Amendment. Originally, the senators were chosen, elected, selected, semantics, however you want to say it, by the state legislature. And they could recall you, you had a 6-year term, but you were essentially appointed. So if one party controlled the legislature, and again, there weren't parties when this government started, they would appoint their guy. And don't kid yourself, it was only guys, because as the women in the room know, you didn't even have the right to vote until last century. So this was a government that was formed by rich white men, many of which were slave owners, that were trying to keep the southern states with the northern states. And in fact, in the negotiations, we had the chief executive being selected or elected in the Electoral College. We had the members of the Senate being selected by the legislature. So the only place where the people that had just fought a revolution, blood had been spilled, lives had been risked, many lives had been lost. And I'm not being dramatic. You live in, New Jersey is essentially the crossroads of the revolution. People in Oregon do not have the same appreciation for revolutionary history as we do because we live it. We grew up here. How many places are there in New Jersey? Washington slept here. There's none in Oregon. And I'm not criticizing Oregon. I'm trying to put it in perspective. So back to the House of Representatives. One of the primary issues that they were arguing over is the issue of slavery. Now, what we also forget, and again, I'm bringing this out because part of the reason why no one discovered this, and I blame myself for the same thing, it's kind of like, and this is going to be an extreme example, it's kind of like having an uncle that went to jail for being a child molester. We don't like to talk about and think about our past history as a slave-allowing country. Because by our standards today, it's inconceivable that that was not only allowed to occur, but it took a civil war to end it. And even then, it took another 100 years and amendments to the Constitution, doing away with the poll tax, things like that, before there were equal freedoms. And I'm not even so sure today, in some parts of the country, it still has been attained. But my point is, slavery has its dirty fingerprints all over this story, and I'm going to tell you what. As you may know, and if you don't know, I'll tell you, or if you knew and forgot, I'm going to remind you. Under the original form of the Constitution, when determining membership of the House of Representatives, it was agreed that there would be a ratio of no less than 1 for 30,000. So the 30,000 was a floor. So you couldn't have 1 for 29,000. So it was a pretty big ratio. That's number one. Number two, it would be based upon the population. But the population is calculated in the census as only politicians. And again, I have great reverence because unlike people that throw out, the founding fathers, I know their names, I know their beliefs, I know their foibles. I love Thomas Jefferson. I'm a huge fan. He was a genius. He was also an adulterer who had an affair with, when he was in France with a married woman and came back here and if DNA is to be believed, may or may not have had, children with one of his slaves. He was a great man, but as all men, he was flawed and had flaws. But we venerate these people in a context in history because it makes us feel good, which is okay when you're talking about social history, but not when you're talking about legal history, because facts matter. I had a friend, one of my best friends in law school passed away. He had a great line. He says, 95% of life is just showing up. I said, yes, Ed, but 5%, that's where the difference is. And if you're 95% right, even if you show up, that still means you're 5% wrong. Now the problem is, if the 5% that you're wrong on is on something significant, then there's a problem. Back to representation. During that summer, they fought hard, and they came to this compromise because the southern states wanted to count slavery, and the northern states said, well, you'll get too many representatives if we do that. And the northern state economy was largely based upon manufacturing or production, and the southern economy was largely agrarian. And so the deal was struck that for census purposes, people, even children, women who couldn't vote or participate in the political process, would be counted. But they didn't even use the word slave, but others, indentured slave servitude, would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, can you imagine that negotiation? 3/5. Now, what about 7/10? No. I think that's too much. That's what they arrived at. And when we make laws, we always draw arbitrary distinctions. You're 18 years old, you're an adult. You're 17, you're not. You're 21, you can drink. You're 19, you can't. I don't know. That's what we do with laws. And that's what they did with that. And that remained intact and in place until the so-called 13th Amendment. There's a reason why I say the so-called 13th Amendment, and I'll get to that in a moment. Back to representation. So, when they proposed the Constitution to the states, it was not brought on with such acclaim by everyone that there wasn't universal consent and agreement that this was a great document. You know, they wanted to make many changes, and of course the argument becomes, do we make changes before we enact it, or do we allow it to become law? Because once we allow it to become law, we're never going to make any changes. So in the state ratifying conventions, before it became law, many of the states requested or demanded that the Constitution have certain amendments made to it. Now today, 225 years later, all of the books that you'll read and the scholars will concentrate on the warm and fuzzy story about the Bill of Rights and how the Founding Fathers were interested in guaranteeing our rights to bear arms, not have people quartered in our homes, and to speak for speech and religion and things like that. And that, while that makes good copy and good story, it is similar to the way that we have objectified people like Thomas Jefferson. Because the practical reality is, it ain't the truth. During the ratifying conventions, just like during the summer of 1787, the hottest debate wasn't over speech and religion, wasn't over a Bill of Rights. In fact, 3 members that were present and stayed till the end refused to sign the Constitution. George Mason of Virginia, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and Edmund Randolph of Virginia as well. And the primary reasons, while Mason is attributed largely because it didn't contain a Bill of Rights, because he wrote the Virginia Bill of Rights, which was largely what the amendments were predicated upon, was because it didn't contain what he viewed as an adequate guarantee of the right of the people to have sufficient and adequate representation. Now, how do I know that? Well, because I was at Williams College. Other people have read things in books. What I'm telling you tonight, I'm not telling you anything I read out of a book if I didn't eyeball the actual document myself. Now, when I showed my research to Williams College, which is one of the oldest colleges, liberal arts colleges in the nation, they also happen to have one of the best collections of rare books and rare documents. They have George Washington's copy of the Federalist Papers, one of signed by George Washington, 2 volumes. They closed the museum to let me play with them and photograph them for my book. I must say, of all the things, that impressed me. They have one of George Washington's early printings of the laws of the first session of Congress. They have George Mason's copy of the September 12th in working progress print of the Constitution, where he wrote on the back in his own hand why he wasn't going to sign. So when I tell you George Mason didn't sign, primarily because it was about representation and not about the Bill of Rights, it's because he listed that before the Bill of Rights. And I saw it with my own eyes. And I brought things to show you tonight. When I tell you these things, there's nothing that I've left to chance. Back to representation. Article 1, Paragraph 1, 435 members of the House of Representatives. Well, that's because Congress, in the original version of the Constitution, was given discretion to fix the size of the House. Not that complicated, except the states didn't trust Congress. Basically, the argument in layman's terms was, wait a second, we just fought a revolution, and we are not going to give you guys the power to decide how powerful you are going to be. What do you think, we're stupid? To quote my brother again, if you're sitting at a poker table, and you're looking around, and you can't figure out who the sucker is, guess what? These people didn't have iPhones, but they were no dummies. Okay? They lived in a different time, but they were just as smart, if not smarter, than we are. Okay? I wouldn't want to play Jeopardy with Thomas Jefferson, recognizing his flaws like everyone else. We all have flaws. But back to representation. So the state ratifying conventions demanded, it was a compromise essentially, and they recommended amendments, a whole host of amendments, like 124. But 6 states demanded that there be a change to the form in which members of the House of Representatives were calculated and how that was all decided. 6 states. And in fact, at the end of the process, after everything was done, at the request of Edmund Randolph, who was one of the people who refused to sign in Philadelphia, a Richmond printer by the name of Augustine Davis, at his request, collected all of the objections and requests from the state ratifying conventions and printed them in a pamphlet. It's extremely rare. It's very hard to find, even in digital format. I don't own an original copy, but the pamphlet is reprinted in this book here. And it lists, and I'm not going to waste your time going over it right now, but it lists verbatim. It is a photoreal reproduction of the demand and request for amendments. But the point being, states were not worried about speech and religion. Some were saying, oh yeah, we want a Bill of Rights. Because at the time, every state constitution had a Bill of Rights. So the argument was, we don't need a Bill of Rights because the state constitutions protect them. And it was like, all right, forget about the Bill of Rights, but what is this 1 to 30,000 stuff? And they make the rules stuff. That's no good. So James Madison wanted to be a senator. Richard Henry Lee ultimately wound up becoming a senator. And Patrick Henry made sure James Madison did not become a senator. So James Madison, who played an integral role at the convention in drafting the Constitution, in his own home state, was not supported and didn't become a senator. So then he had to run for the House of Representatives. And they ran a young fellow by the name of James Monroe, who was a war hero. You know who James Monroe is? He later went on to be president, but he's also famous at that time, more so in 1789, he was more famous for being a hero in the Revolutionary War, one of only 2 people that was actually wounded at the Battle of Trenton on Christmas Eve. So they're running a war hero against James Madison, this intellectual effete guy who went to Princeton, and they're basically saying, just like the campaigns really between Lonergan and Booker right now, yes, no, blah, blah, whatever. That campaign, yes, no, was about, well, the people want amendments, and James Monroe said, Madison's not going to make any amendments. He wrote the Constitution. He's not going to change his own thing. He won't admit he's wrong. So that was the issue in that campaign. And ultimately, Madison had to come forward and say, I absolutely will pass amendments. I will take the forefront, because the argument was, do we pass amendments by having the legislature propose them, or do we have a second national convention? And of course, the theory was the second national convention would be disastrous because nothing could ever get started. So they wanted, they being the Federalists, or the Friends of the Constitution as they were called, to avoid a second convention at all costs. So Madison won in a rather close election. It was like, I think it was 1,100 to 800 and change. He won the election, and he went to Congress. Now, when you make a campaign promise, the problem is you sometimes have to follow through. So, well, at the time they took that stuff seriously. So Madison has now sworn to everyone on his honor he's going to pass and bring forth amendments at the time. And really, once the Constitution was ratified, no one was really chirping and barking for amendments to the same extent as the people were in Virginia, and they were really only doing it to defeat Madison. Now Madison made a promise, and he's got to keep up with it. Now, Congress meets for the first time on March 4th, 1789 in New York, not in Philadelphia, not in Washington. And one of the first orders of business is they've got to figure out how they're going to proceed, how they're going to organize the government. Now, Madison wants to avoid a second convention, and he's got to keep his campaign promise. And Madison, who was somewhat of a political maven even at that point, gets up and he tries to bring forward amendments. And of course, he gets shot down and screamed down saying, we're too busy. What are you kidding me? We haven't even gotten off the ground. You want to amend this thing? We haven't even formed committees yet. We have no rules. But he's got to keep his promise. So ultimately, to cut to the chase, he proposes an amendment, and I think it was the second of the 24 or so amendments he originally proposed. And that would have guaranteed perpetual growth in the House of Representatives until it reached the size of 200. And that was essentially rejected. And they then sent the issue of amendments to a committee of the whole from the committee of the whole House of Representatives to a special committee of one representative from each state. Now, John Vining from Delaware was, of course, the member from Delaware because Delaware had one representative. Now, mind you, 95% right makes it 5% wrong. We tell, oh, all 13 states were there. That's not the truth. The first federal Congress was 11 states because North Carolina had not ratified the Constitution to join the Union yet. Reason being, they said, we're not joining until there's a guarantee of amendments. Rhode Island didn't join for other reasons. Their attitude was, You can't start this new government because the Articles of Confederation requires all 13 of us to agree, and your new Constitution said you only have to have 9 people agree, 9 states agree. And of course, Rhode Island, which is this big, with a population this big, was essentially ignored. And after the government was going on, by 1790, when they were basically taking a position and Alexander Hamilton was putting pressure on saying, okay, you're not going to join us, you're a foreign nation, so when your cows are sold to people in Connecticut, we're going to charge you an import tax. What? That's true. Don't kid yourself. This is the truth. Vermont came kicking and screaming, but they came. And it didn't occur until May of 1790. But that's how it happened. But, we don't talk about that stuff. It's like slavery, because it makes us uncomfortable. It's like, oh, everyone wasn't all warm and fuzzy. And during the ratification debates, we talk about the Federalist Papers with such veneration. Like I said, I've held lots of old books. Holding George Washington's books, that was a little different. Okay. But, I have a picture. This is my copy of the Federalist Papers. I bought it at Barnes & Noble on clearance for $8.95. Says the same thing. Says the same thing with the forward from some people from Harvard University in 1950s. But everyone today thinks, oh, this is only the only part of the debate. No. The Anti-Federalists published loads of paperwork. And, I didn't bring those volumes because they're too big, but here's just some of the significant stuff written by the people who I talked about that refused to sign the convention. I'm not going to pass this around because it'll muddy what I'm trying to explain. So, the committee meets. John Bonney from Delaware is the chairman, whether happenstance or whatever, and one representative from each state is on the committee. Of course, Madison is Virginia's representative on the committee. They're forming the government during the summer of 1789, and as they approach August, they decide that they want to have certain amendments. So they have 18 proposals that they come up with, coming out of the committee. And then they send it to the committee of the whole to debate. And that has the original version that said, oh, we're going to guarantee perpetual growth until there's 200. Now, mind you, it was a ceiling of 200 in the context of, at the time, 11 states expecting Rhode Island and North Carolina to eventually join, and what we today refer to as the Ohio River Valley. So the country's borders were essentially defined at that point, geographically. Now they expected that the population would increase, but no one was planning for Louisiana Purchase. That's when everything changed. So in any event, back to 1789. So they were fighting over the summer, and like I said, I love how we look at these old-time political debates and arguments, like they were all friends and stuff. The stuff today is soft and anemic. They were violent. They had duels. They hit each other. That's what happened in the House of Representatives. The Senate, which was called the upper house because they met upstairs, not because they were superior, theoretically co-equal branch. They're still today called the upper house, but it's because they met upstairs. They didn't have the same problems. But of course, the whole point was the House of Representatives was supposed to be the people's house. Today, if you want to talk to a representative, now, I use this example. The average ratio proportion today is one representative for every 750,000 people. The census in 2010 was slightly around, I think it was 320 million people nationwide. When you do that on the aggregate, since each state's guaranteed one, Wyoming only has like 600,030 people. So they have the smallest proportion. Montana has a ratio of one representative for every 1.3 million people. My point being, if you've ever been to see a football game, watch the Eagles, or if you're from North Jersey, where I'm from, the Giants. For example, Giants Stadium fits about 70,000 people. Okay, do that by 10, add a few more, and that's how many each representative represents. Now the concept originally was so you could call your representative, and they could essentially be your lobbyist in Washington, or not Washington, with the national government. Now, can you get a phone call returned by your local representative? Now, let me turn around. You guys are Tea Party people. You're in Mr. Runyon's district. You probably might.
No.
Okay, well.
We were just there. We were just there.
Okay. I'm not trying to insult it. I'm just trying to make my point. It's like you people are politically active. You're the type of people he should be sucking up to. So if you're someone that just has a problem with your Social Security, with your veterans disability pension or something like that, how are you supposed to get it resolved? The idea was you could call your congressman and they would fix it for you. You remember the House of Representatives. But again, it's attributed largely to a never had a pot big enough story. And today, exactly, if you want to talk to your congressman, you can pay $500 to go to a fundraiser. Or if they do something for you, the first thing they're going to send you is a letter for a campaign donation. And, or you can hire a lobbyist. Now, part of this got me thinking, because I was doing some work about the apportionment, and I'll tell you, I don't want to go off on a tangent here because I want to stick on the message because I want to get through this whole thing to get to the real meat. And I was speaking to a gentleman who founded a college down in Northern Virginia called Patrick Henry College. And he was working on apportionment issues in Montana. And he essentially formed a college for people to go to homeschool. Okay? Now, the funny thing is, you always got to be careful who you're talking to. Because I'm known as a historian, a constitutional scholar, and a civil rights lawyer. I also happen to be a devout Christian, things like that. And so I was talking to them, and in their neck of the woods, so to speak, in their part of Virginia, they have about 80,000 people that live and subscribe to their very, very conservative views. Maybe people think you're conservative. And I don't mean that in a bad way. The whole point is you can live however you want. It's the freedom concept. But the point is, when I spoke about this with someone else and about how they were fighting for representation, how they felt it was unfair, they said, well, oh, those crazy Christians. I just listened and I said, okay, now I'm thinking like, I also happen to be a crazy Christian. Not maybe as conservative as them, but okay. And I started thinking like, well, why with 80,000 people, when did 80,000 stop being a big number? Why shouldn't, whether you agree with them or not, why shouldn't they have their own seat at the table? You know, they may not win the debate, but at least if you had an opportunity to participate in the debate, maybe you wouldn't feel so bad. Maybe you wouldn't be so angry and feel so powerless. So I got thinking, like, you know, this doesn't make any sense. So I started looking and I thought, like, you know, what about Article the First? Now let me explain to you what Article the First is, to cut to the meat. In late August of 1789, Madison's proposal was resoundingly rejected by the House. Not because they didn't want to change the manner in which apportionment would be handled in the future, but because it didn't go far enough. So what the whole House ultimately did is they passed a three-line, three-step process, reducing it to a numbers game. It is a mathematical equation, and it is very simple. You have one representative for every 30,000 people until you reach 100 representatives. Then at that point, the ratio increases to you have one representative for every 40,000 people. And then when you reach 200, the ratio goes up to you never have more than one for every 50,000 people.
Repeat that.
Okay, do you understand what I'm saying? There's a census population of 320 million people in this country. And according to what Congress wanted, demanded, and the only compromise they would accept was that there would never be a scenario, never, where you would have one representative for every 750,000 people, or in Montana, one for every 1.3 million people. It was intended to be a specific constitutional guarantee. Now, if that were enacted into law, that would mean today we would have in excess of 6,000 people in the House of Representatives. Just follow me, just bear with me for a moment. The Electoral College would be 6,200 and change, or whatever. And everyone said, oh, that's bigger government, I'm against bigger government. I said, I'm against bigger government too. I'm in favor of bigger democracy. The government